Hi everyone, I'm Eleanor. It's Friday afternoon and I was sitting here with my cup of coffee and thinking how I've really gone deeper into these books I'm reading in a way that doesn't really allow me access to talking about them logically. But then I thought, no, maybe that's an excuse, and maybe actually attempting to talk here while recording will allow me to clarify some things that are going through my head. So here goes. What I'll start with is explaining that I'm in a poetry writing workshop with an amazing teacher called Joshua Megan, and it's a short course on prosody, which means, learning the traditional craft of English poetry. And I cannot tell you how much I love it. I love it so much. It's like the most engrossing linguistic puzzle work that has unexpected and delightful outcomes. And it's not really until you try it seriously as an exercise, knowing that you're going to be handing it in to someone who knows, how to give you that fantastic feedback, that you realize how important it is. To poetry, my poetry writing is a hobby, but apart from that, to the reading of poetry as well, you realize what could potentially go into writing poetry, and what a lot of poets nowadays have discarded, for better or worse. I think worse, just from my own experiences. So when I'm talking about prosody, I'm talking about the rhythm of words when they are put together. So it's not just a template of rhythms, it's a rhythm that is specific to each phrase and then each line of a poem, and is very similar to music. And because we're doing these exercises where we're told exactly what we need to use, what kind of meter we're supposed to use, let's say write a line in iambic pentameter, write 10 lines in iambic pentameter. Because of that, you push yourself in different directions, because the words you want to use originally, with whatever your original intent was, don't fit the rhythm. And so you start experimenting. And so it really is really shocking to me why poets who use the rules of prosody and follow them, why they are not called experimentalists, because it's actually those poets who are experimenting the most. When you sit down to write without those rules and you make up your own rules as you go, that's not necessarily experimental. That could be an absolutely straightforward line that you're drawing, in a way, from your intent at the beginning of writing and the outcome. So you want to write using these words and these thoughts, and you do. And everything else has to change according to your intent. But when you're taking on a constraint, for example, that the line has to sound like this, ta-da, ta-ta, 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 you can't use the words you want, and you have to really change what you're writing. And that's when I came across a quote this is from the internet, so who knows if it was really Goethe, and I don't know if I'm even pronouncing it correctly, but in any case, he apparently said that a poet knows what he wanted to write but doesn't know what he wrote. And I think that's even more apparent when you're using these rules of prosody. They're so incredibly helpful, so fun, and there's so much potential for experimentation. So on that note, I will recommend this book that was recommended to me by Joshua Megan. It's by Timothy Steele. It's an older book. All the funds in how you say a thing, an explanation of meter and versification. I bought it used online a couple of years ago when it was first recommended to me when I did Josh Megan's class on rhyme. And of course, why would I read something that I bought, right? But this time I'm so intrigued by the study of prosody. I actually have to say I pretty much read it cover to cover, underlined a lot, learned so much, and it's something I will have with me forever. It goes into details that a real poetry geek would love. But what I found actually is that I'm so deeply immersed in my own poetry, in my own poetic geekiness, that I have lost perspective of how much that actually has happened. For example, today I was talking to a couple of friends and giving them examples of things I had learned. And I realized pretty quickly that the fact that I take this stuff so seriously is very odd within the general reality of everyday life and generally other people. So that was kind of funny. Another geeky discovery, if you've been playing along, you saw that I recommended Edward Hirsch's, as I call him, my friend Mr. Hirsch, his A Poet's Glossary. Well, I mean, really, I found something better. Again, Joshua Megan mentioned this encyclopedia in passing. I immediately ordered it, and boy, was I shocked when it arrived. It's called the Princeton Encyclopedia of Poetry and Poetics, 4th edition, and may I introduce you to my new best friend. Now, I know you're laughing, and also you're probably perhaps rolling your eyes. A lot of people have probably clicked off already because of this, but I have to say this has not disappointed, because of course I immediately went to look up metaphor and simile, which I've been talking about before, and looked up in a poet's glossary, and there's no comparison. I will say it is as big as it looks, but of course it is as thorough as it looks as well. The print is teeny tiny, and the pages are super, super thin. And yet, I'll give you an example. Something I looked up only yesterday. I was reading, who was I reading? Alice Oswald, who I keep coming back to again and again. And she had a poem that she titled Ballad, there was ballad in the title, and I thought, you know what, Eleanor, you really should know what a ballad really is, the definition. Well, I looked up ballad, and wouldn't you know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages on the ballad, everything from regional and linguistic variation, oral and written ballads, scholarship and influence in literary history. If you really are enjoying your poetry, this is the one to go for. If I may be so bold as to make that recommendation. Engrossed, quite deeply. I've been deeply engrossed in 2 poetry books that are absolutely different from each other, both of them in translation. The first is Wislawa Szymborska's book. What's it called? Here. Translated by Claire Kavanagh and Stanislav Baranchak. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. She is no longer with us. She won the Nobel Prize and is a huge, huge, huge Polish poet, much loved. Then I heard about, again, excuse me if I don't quite get the pronunciation right, of a Dutch poet, Nachoem Weinberg. Hello to Anne Novella. I want to talk to you about this. Translated by David Colmer. How I came across him is that the New York Review Books just came out very recently with this brand new translation. I think it's the first time he's been translated in this extremely, in this all-encompassing way. There are poems here from his first book, 1989, all the way to his latest in 2022. So I thought, okay, this is a chance, and I didn't really plan, hey, let's retranslate poetry. It just sort of happened. And before I talk about those two poets, I should mention that I bought this before I really knew about Fitzcarraldo. Didn't really realize what it was, why it was white with the blue font, wasn't involved in booktube at all. This is called This Little Art by Kate Briggs. She's a translator, and this is a marvelous book about her experiences of being a translator, anecdotes, etc. At the time I read this and loved it. You don't have to be into literature or translating really to enjoy it, but I mean, of course it helps. And I hadn't gone back to it in a few years, and so I went back and I can't say I even came close to rereading it. I just looked at, a few things that I'd underlined, and I realized that the main thing I got out of this is that, how shall I summarize? Isn't it wonderful that there's translation in the world? Translators are very important people. A translation, of course, is never going to be exact. Everything, it's really the creation of the translator using the original text. There was a lot of feel-good phrasing and anecdotes about translation, and I really liked that. Then I come to these two books, and this is years later, and now I'm really into my poetry, plus I'm doing a workshop on prosody. So the workshop is all about what is the musical nature, what is the rhythm that gives the poem its tone, its feeling, what are the sounds, how are they accented? What are the beats? Yeah? So I come to this, and of course I immediately realize this. It's only logical. No poem in translation is ever going to have the same sound or the same rhythm as the original. And I have to say that I've come quite far from this stage of looking at translation, and I'm much more pragmatic now. And I think I had much more of a shock awakening about this with this book by Wislawa Szymborska, because the poems in this sound extraordinarily stilted to me. Now, I don't know any Polish. And they do give the Polish on one page and the English on the other, and you can see similar forms usually. And sometimes you can, read and you can read the Polish just to see the sounds, just to hear the sounds, excuse me. But so I thought, oh, it's just me. I'm not reading it correctly. So I I Googled these two translators, and everyone is just loving. These translators have been reviewed. Claire Kavanagh, Stanislav Baranjak have been reviewed. They've been lauded as the creme de la creme. So what can I say? So two things I can say. First of all, I think that if I were to recommend starting reading Szymborska, I would not start with this. From what I found, it's I think it's her second last book. It's recommended really, and if I'd done my research, I would have purchased the more complete version, anthology of her work. I think that would make a difference. And, you know, I wish I'd vlogged reading this book, because when I first picked it up, I was actually horrified. It seemed so truly simplistic, almost childish. And I had bought it for the Steele challenge, and I wanted to read it, you know, on one of the days. And I simply couldn't. I couldn't get myself to talk about this because I felt so negatively, I felt so critical of it. And yet I knew that she was a Nobel Prize winner. There must be something wrong with me. And also, she's so popular. She's incredibly popular in translation all over the world, as well as in Polish. So I picked it up about a month or two later. And I have to say, she's grown on me. She's definitely grown on me. I think the simplicity of the lines is actually the very first level that entices you into the world of the poem. And then by the end of the poem, she somehow flips your world just a little bit. And I enjoyed that. And I mean, also, if you look at the picture, there's also something about her personality. Look at this picture. I mean, have you ever? This is who I want to be. This is who I want to be when I get to be a bit older. She has a joie de vivre, and she writes about everyday things in everyday language, as far as I can tell. But she definitely has her own vision, and I'll give you an example because you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. For example, when she talks about the titular poem here, she starts to list things that we have here, and she says, I can't speak for elsewhere, but here on earth, we've got a fair supply of everything. Here we manufacture chairs and sorrows, scissors, tenderness, transistors, violins, teacups, dams, and quips. So it seems a bit silly. It seems really almost foolish, a bit childish. But when you think about it a bit more, you see what she's doing. She's elaborating on this notion that there is a here, that we are all in the same place, and there is somewhere other than where we are. And this place that is other than where we are has different emotions and has different objects. And people there create possibly different things. And then I think, wait a minute, people there, what are we talking about? And you see, that's how she gets you in. And it's a long poem, it's 2 pages. And by the end, she really sticks the landing of the poem, is the best way I can put it. She says, just take a closer look. The table stands exactly where it stood. The piece of paper still lies where it was spread. Through the open window comes a breath of fresh air. The walls reveal no terrifying cracks through which nowhere might extinguish you. And by saying that, of course, I immediately think the walls do reveal terrifying cracks through which everything will one day extinguish all of us. And that, I think, is the power of most of the poems in this book. I can't speak to her other books. And I really appreciated that. And I began to enjoy the way her poems progress. And there's also a feeling of quaint nostalgia in some of the vocabulary she uses, which I'm sure the translators worked very hard to keep. I'll give another example. In her poem Teenager, another 2-page poem, super easy reading, short lines. She's thinking about who she was as a teenager. So she starts, me, a teenager, and then she talks about her as a teenager in third person. If she suddenly stood here now before me, would I need to treat her as near and dear, although she's strange to me and distant? And then she works through that idea. And as someone, who's middle-aged, I found that found that quite endearing, frankly, and even my old cynical self, my heart was beginning to melt. And then she hit the landing again, because then she says she's saying goodbye to her teenage self. They met, and in her imagination, nothing in parting, a fixed smile and no emotion. Only when she vanishes, leaving her scarf in her haste. And that's something else. The teenage Szymborska has met the older one, and then she vanishes, leaving only a scarf. It feels like a science fiction scene. And it reminds me also of the poem here that sort of feels like a scene from science fiction, but old-fashioned, nostalgic science fiction, if that makes sense. Almost like the Twilight Zone, maybe. The black and white original Twilight Zone. But then, okay, how she sticks the landing. So only when she vanishes, leaving her scarf in her haste. Now, a scarf of genuine wool in colored stripes, crocheted for her by our mother. I've still got it. The first person plural, our mother. So it's two entities. Her teenage self is so different to her that it's she and I, our. And then, see, I got shivers down my spine because because I also have a mother and I had a grandmother, and they both knitted me, and my, they knit me scarves and blankets, and I've still got it. So yes, that time has moved on. That person doesn't exist anymore. But I've got the same scarf that she had given to me by the same woman who gave it to her. And that's really lovely. Now, so why do I think the translation is bad? You're probably thinking those poems were really lovely, Eleanor, and why would that be? Well, because on page 53, there's the most horrible, horrible poem. It's called Ella in Heaven. And when I first read it, I thought to myself, I just put a huge question mark, and I thought, first of all, I thought this sounds like a racist poem. Then I thought, I must be mistaken. And then I thought, even if I'm mistaken, I don't want to read the rest of the book. It's put me off that much. I did not know who she was referring to in the title Ella in Heaven, but it's clear that Ella is Black, and there are certain words used here that that didn't sit right with me. So I had a good old. I did a bit of research, and sure enough, there was some. First of all, I immediately found out that it's Ella Fitzgerald, the amazing singer. And that, I don't know, that really made it it made it worse. But then I read that Szymborska was a huge Ella Fitzgerald fan, huge, and had always talked about how one day she would write a poem that captured this love she has for the amazing Ella Fitzgerald. And then I came across some reader, not a critic, not a reviewer, some reader on his, I don't even remember who, and they said, you know what, I have a problem with this poem. So I saw that it wasn't only me. Suffice to say that I did even deeper research, and I found a completely different translation of the last line of the poem. And instead of, you know what? I actually don't want to read out loud the last line because I really don't like it. No, it's not that I don't like it. It sounds racist. The other translation I found is not racist at all, but it's clunky. And it shows me whatever the original Polish is, and how it should be translated, there's no doubt in my mind that the translation in this book is terrible. It's terrible. So, okay. Then, moving on to Nachoem and Weinberg. Why am I smiling? First of all, if you can go from one extreme to the other in poetry, this is it. Szymborska to Weinberg. I'm smiling because, wow, I haven't come across a poet like Weinberg ever. I really like him. I quickly read the blurb on the back when I got the book, and it says here, it quotes Weinberg as saying, quote, "Alienation is the last thing I'm trying to achieve. The world is strange enough as it is, and my poems help in dealing with that strangeness by bringing it close and as far as possible trying to understand it." So I thought to myself, oh, okay, he's not going to be a difficult poem. No, the reason he was saying this was in his defense, because I'm sure many readers are saying this is so alienating and so difficult, and he's saying, but I don't mean for it to be alienating and difficult. Now, another reason I'm laughing is because how funny is it? I mean, this really sums up the kind of poet he is. He's bringing the strangeness close and as far as possible trying to understand it, close and far, even when he's quoted in some dialogue and from some interview, he's using words in this very, very unusual way. And I would say that if you don't like difficult poetry, this is not for you. But if you like philosophical puzzles, if you like logical conundrums and ways of looking at the world that reveal why things we think of as understood and common knowledge are really not, then this is for you. And he has great variety. There's great variety in this book because it takes about 10 poems from each of his books, as I mentioned before. And each of his books is really very specifically formed in a different way from each of the other books. So let me give you some examples. I would say one of my favorite excerpts is from a book he came out with in 2001 called Birds. And in almost all of these poems, there is a bird, but it's always very, very strange. And I keep coming back to them and getting more and more out of them. And as I said, they're sort of conundrums. For example, he has a poem called Horse and Bird. This is how it starts. It's a shortish poem. They're all pretty short. A horse and a bird agree to help each other for a long time while they change, becoming more or less horse and bird. So you see, we're already in this strange world. It feels a bit like a fable. A bird and horse, they're helping each other. They're changing to become more or less. What is the essence of horseness and birdness? See, the philosophy is coming in. It's really rather lovely. I should say he's a professor of economics. So that's an additional thing. Anyway, a horse and a bird agree to together watch the horse and bird that help each other and not point out where more help could be given. Okay, so now we're talking about a different horse and bird that are watching the original horse and bird and not help each other and not point out where more help could be given. This is really quite funny. This is like parents, you know? It's almost like parents. And then you think, is he trying to say male and female without talking about gender? Who knows? Look up. This is the third stanza. Look up. Not stars, but birds. I mean, how could you not love that? But again, oh my goodness, what does it mean? And on the ground, horses that were born with the smell of the sea in their nostrils and compete with the birds. Why are they competing with the birds, and why is it of importance that there's sea in their nostrils? I don't know. And then the fourth and final stanza is entirely in parentheses. Someone would have preferred the horse to disappear before the bird to be able to speak with one when the other was no longer there. Someone, do we have a human in this poem? And they would have preferred for one to disappear. Are we talking about death or just a disappearing act? And this is intriguing because I immediately think of, how, you often will have a friend and you always get together with them with another friend, and you sometimes wish, I just want to get together with that person, not necessarily always with the third person. Or is it something more serious? Or is it not at all anything like that? Because these are horses and birds. You can't say what it's about, but you add so much to it as you read from your own life. I love it. The next poem, still in the bird category. I don't actually think it has a bird in it, but it's called Sirius, and the gist of it is, I'm not going to read it, but just as a little appetizer for you, in case you want to buy the book, which I do recommend. I really recommend this book. The idea is, you say, are you serious? What does it mean when you say serious? I don't know, I can't help it. I'll start the poem. They say if they are serious, like people who have had something disappear forever, or not serious, letting themselves be wanted by whoever is closest. So again, what is it? Oh, okay, so is he talking about relationships? Like, oh, it's not serious. Or if someone has disappeared forever, and because this comes after horse and bird, where you wish for someone to disappear forever, are we talking about dealing with death? Is death the most serious? You see, it's philosophical, it's logical in an illogical way, it's flippin' fantastic. He has another book called Songs, and there's excerpts, there's poems in here from that. And almost all of those poems are called song, and they're completely different in tone, in subject matter, and yes, there's so much to recommend in this. I'm much more a Weinberg fan than a Szymborska fan, but I'm open to reading both further. Okay, I think I'm happy with that. I think I've sort of come to the end of this video. I hope you've gotten something out of it. Yeah. Okay, I wish you all the best, and I'll see you next. I have no idea where poetry will take me next, possibly to prose. Okay, and don't forget, please, that the only real property is the property of the mind. Bye.